At my husband Daniel Reed's birthday party, I walked toward the seat beside him thinking it was my place. But he leaned in and whispered, "Not here. Sit with the guests." Before I could even process his words, his wealthy ex, Victoria Hale, appeared, smiling like she had already been invited into my life and said, "You should take this seat instead." And then she sat down, as if it had been arranged long before I arrived. Daniel didn't stop her. No one did. His family laughed quietly, like I was the mistake in the room, and in that moment I felt something inside me quietly break without making a sound. If this story resonates with you in any way, take a moment to like and subscribe, and share where you are watching from in the world, and what time it is right now in your city. Because sometimes stories like this feel closer than they should, and I want to know where you are hearing this from. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and this is the night my entire understanding of my marriage began to fall apart in front of everyone who was supposed to respect me. It started like any other celebration, lights warm over a long dinner table, laughter rising around expensive wine glasses, and people pretending they understood each other better than they actually did. I stood there in a simple black dress I had chosen carefully that morning, thinking I would sit beside my husband and maybe for once feel included in the world he moved through so easily. But when I reached for the chair next to him, Daniel didn't even look at me fully. He just tilted his head slightly and said it again, quieter this time. "Emily, not here. Sit over there with the guests." His tone wasn't angry. That was the worst part. It was calm, practiced, like I had been reassigned rather than rejected. I remember my hand freezing on the back of the chair, my fingers tightening slightly as I tried to understand what he meant. "Over there?" I asked, my voice low, unsure if I misunderstood. Before he could answer, Victoria stepped in wearing a soft gold dress that caught the light every time she moved, like the room adjusted itself around her presence. She looked at me, not unkindly, but with a kind of effortless certainty that made my chest tighten. "It's fine," she said lightly, as if helping me. "You should take this seat instead. It's more comfortable anyway." And then she sat down right beside Daniel like my absence had been planned as part of the seating arrangement. I turned my eyes to Daniel, waiting for him to correct it, waiting for him to say something simple like, "No, that's my wife's seat," but he didn't. Instead, he leaned back slightly, already engaged in conversation with someone else, as if I had already faded into the background of the night. I slowly stepped away from the table, my heels quiet against the floor, moving toward the outer edge where the guests without names seemed to gather. I could feel the weight of eyes on me, not openly staring, but noticing enough to understand what had just happened. His mother whispered something to his aunt, and they both smiled in a way that didn't include me. I placed my hands gently at my sides, smoothing my dress out of habit more than need, and I said softly, almost politely, "Sorry, everyone." It wasn't an apology for doing something wrong. It was an apology for existing in a space where I apparently didn't belong. That was when I saw my father, Richard Carter, across the room stop mid-conversation. He had been speaking with one of Daniel's business partners, but his attention shifted instantly toward me. His expression changed slowly, like he was connecting something he didn't like the shape of. The room noise continued, glasses clinking, soft music playing, people laughing at jokes that didn't matter. But I felt a strange stillness building around me anyway. Daniel still hadn't looked at me. Victoria was laughing at something he said now, leaning slightly closer, completely comfortable in the space I had just been removed from. I stood there, trying to understand how something so small could feel so final. It wasn't just a seat. It was placement, belonging, hierarchy, and I was suddenly at the edge of all of it. My mother Margaret sat a few feet away and said nothing, only watching me with a face I couldn't read. I remember thinking, strangely clear, that no one here was surprised except me. And then I noticed something else, something subtle but off. My father was no longer listening to the man he was speaking with. His hand had gone still around his glass. His eyes were fixed on me now, not confused, but alert, like he had just heard a signal no one else had noticed. Daniel finally glanced in my direction, just briefly, and in that moment I saw something I had never seen before in his expression. Not anger, not love, not even indifference. It was hesitation, like he was waiting for something to happen that he wasn't fully prepared for. And that was when my phone vibrated quietly in my hand. One message, no name, just a line that read, "They think tonight is about him. It's not." I looked up slowly. the room suddenly feeling less like a celebration and more like a stage where I had been placed without being told the script. And for the first time that night, I realized something wasn't just wrong, it was hidden, and whatever had been hidden had something to do with me. The message on my phone lingered in my hand as the noise of the party blurred around me, and I suddenly felt like I was standing in two places at once, one in that bright, expensive dining room, and another much farther away in a time I had spent most of my life trying not to revisit. I did not move back toward the table. I just stood near the edge of the room watching people laugh like nothing had changed, but everything inside me had shifted in a way I could not explain yet. And without meaning to, I started remembering things I had buried for years. I grew up in a house where attention was never shared equally, where my father Richard Carter built his life around control and expectation, and where my mother Margaret Carter learned early how to keep peace by choosing sides quietly. I was the child who learned to read silence more than words. I still remember being 9 years old, standing in our kitchen in Chicago, holding a school award certificate I had worked months to earn. I walked toward the dining table where my parents were sitting and said, "I got first place in the district math competition." My mother glanced at it briefly before setting her coffee down. "That is nice, Emily," she said in a tone that told me it was not enough to interrupt her morning. My father did not even look up from his newspaper. "Your cousin Daniel just got accepted into a summer leadership program," he said instead. Folding the paper like that was the continuation of my achievement. I remember holding that certificate tighter, the paper bending slightly in my hand, and asking quietly, "Did you hear me?" My mother finally looked at me then and smiled in a way that felt rehearsed. "We heard you. Just do not make everything a competition, sweetheart." That sentence followed me for years, at school events, at birthdays, at dinner tables. I learned that my achievements were background noise in a family that already decided who mattered most. Daniel Reed, who would later become my husband, was not part of my childhood, but the pattern of comparison was already there before I even knew his name existed. When I was 16, I remember overhearing my mother on the phone saying, "Daniel is so impressive for his age, Richard. He reminds me so much of you." I did not know then that admiration could be distributed so unevenly that it shaped entire futures. At home, even objects carried hierarchy. There was a framed photograph on the living room wall of Daniel, shaking hands with a city council member at some youth event, while my own school awards were kept in a drawer in the hallway, never displayed unless company was coming that required proof I existed. One evening, I asked my father why my photo was not on the wall. He looked at me briefly and said, "You will understand when something of yours matters long term." I did not know what that meant then, but I learned to translate it as I am not the version of success they are looking for. Years later, when I met Daniel at a university alumni event, it felt strangely familiar the way people looked at him before he even spoke, like they had already assigned him importance. He remembered my last name immediately. "Carter," he said, smiling. "Your father works in corporate consulting, right?" I nodded, not correcting him when he assumed that meant something more about me than it did. My mother was thrilled when I first mentioned him. "Finally, someone with direction," she said, as if I had been wandering without purpose until he appeared. I remember sitting at dinner that night while she described Daniel's future like it was already decided. "He will go far," she said, cutting into her food carefully. "Men like him do not stay small." I asked her softly, "What about me?" And she laughed lightly like I had told a joke. "You are different, Emily. You observe. That is your role." I did not understand then that being described as an observer was just another way of saying, you are not expected to lead anything. Even after I married Daniel, I noticed how easily old patterns returned. At family gatherings, my father would ask Daniel about his career before he even acknowledged my presence. My mother would rearrange seating, so I was always slightly outside the center of conversation. Once I asked her directly, "Why do you always put me there?" And she answered without hesitation, "Because you are comfortable there." That sentence sat inside me longer than I expected. Comfortable there. Like I had chosen invisibility instead of being placed into it. I thought maybe things would change after marriage, but instead I learned how quiet exclusion can become when it is dressed as tradition. I remember one Christmas dinner when Daniel's family joined ours. My mother introduced him to every guest as if he was the only accomplishment in the room, while I was introduced as an afterthought. "And this is Emily. She works with nonprofits sometimes." I had built my own consulting practice by then, but I did not correct her. I had learned that correction only made me sound defensive in a language that never considered my truth first. That night, sitting in the present again at Daniel's birthday party, I realized something I had avoided for years. The way Victoria sat in my place was not new. It was just more visible. The pattern had always been there, from childhood tables to adult rooms, shifting slowly until I stopped noticing it as abnormal. I looked across the room and saw my father watching me with an expression I could not read, like he was seeing something he had not accounted for before. And for the first time, I wondered if he had always known something I did not about the way this story was supposed to unfold, because in that moment, just as I started to feel the weight of every memory pressing together, my father stood up from his seat and walked toward the center of the room without saying a word. And every instinct I had told me that whatever was about to happen next was not part of the version of my life I had been allowed to see until now. That night, I stood near the edge of the ballroom watching my father walk slowly toward the center of the room, and something in the air shifted before he even spoke, like the entire celebration had unknowingly paused for him. Daniel was still seated at the main table, laughing quietly at something Victoria Hale had said, completely unaware that the rhythm of the room was changing behind him. I felt my phone still vibrating in my hand from the unknown message, but I could not focus on it anymore because my father's presence had already taken over every part of the space. Richard Carter stopped directly in the center, not raising his voice, not asking for attention, but receiving it anyway in the way powerful people always do without trying. He looked at Daniel first, then at Victoria, then finally at me, and for a brief moment our eyes met, and I saw something there I had never seen before in him. Not pride, not anger, but recognition. "Before this evening continues," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the music and conversation like a clean line through fabric, "I think it is important to clarify something about this event and about the assumptions being made here." A few guests shifted in their seats, unsure whether to listen or continue pretending nothing unusual was happening. Daniel straightened slightly, finally noticing the change in tone, and Victoria stopped smiling in the way she had been smiling all night. My mother Margaret looked down at her hands, suddenly very interested in the glass in front of her. I stayed where I was, still near the edge of the room, feeling like I was no longer just attending a party, but standing inside a moment that had been waiting years to arrive. My father continued, his voice steady but precise. "This celebration was organized under certain expectations," he said, glancing briefly at Daniel's father seated across the table. "But there are details that were not properly communicated to everyone present." Daniel let out a small nervous laugh, trying to recover control of the room. "Mr. Carter, I am not sure what this is about, but this is my birthday dinner." My father turned slightly toward him. "Yes, Daniel, I am aware," he said, and that was when the smile on Daniel's face began to fade. Victoria shifted in her chair, her fingers tightening slightly around her glass, as if she suddenly felt the temperature of the room change. My father continued, "It has come to my attention that certain seating arrangements were made tonight that do not reflect the actual structure of authority connected to this gathering." A quiet murmur moved through the guests. I felt my chest tighten slightly, not because I understood everything, but because I understood enough to know that something was being exposed in layers. Daniel finally looked at me properly for the first time that evening, his expression no longer casual but unsettled. "Emily," he said quietly, almost as if asking me to explain something I had not yet. I could not. Because in that moment, I realized I was no longer just a guest in this story. My father stepped closer to the table, placing one hand lightly on the back of an empty chair at the center position, the one I had been removed from earlier without explanation. "This seat," he said, "was never symbolic. It was assigned." Victoria's expression changed instantly, her confidence slipping just slightly at the edges. Daniel leaned forward, confused now, his voice lower. "Assigned by who?" My father paused for a moment, and in that silence the entire room seemed to lean closer without realizing it. He turned his head slightly toward me again, and I felt something inside me tighten, as if a door I had never seen was beginning to open. "By the person who actually structured the terms of ownership tied to this entire event," he said carefully. The words did not land immediately for most people, but I saw it when they did land, slowly, like gravity catching up to a falling object. Daniel's posture changed. Victoria stopped breathing as comfortably as she had been. My mother finally looked up, her eyes narrowing as if she was trying to calculate something she had overlooked. And then my father said something that made the entire room go still. "Emily Carter is not a guest at this table in the way you have all assumed." A silence dropped so completely that even the background music felt distant. I felt every eye in the room shift toward me at once, and I did not move. I did not speak. Because in that moment I realized that whatever my father was about to reveal next was not just about this party anymore. It was about everything that had led me here, everything I had been told to accept, and everything that had been carefully hidden long before tonight ever began. And as Daniel slowly turned toward me with a look I had never seen on his face before, I understood one thing clearly. This was no longer the beginning of the humiliation I thought I had experienced. It was the beginning of something I had not yet been allowed to see. The silence in the room felt heavier after my father's words, as if every person at the table was waiting for the next sentence to decide what reality they were standing in. And Daniel Reed was the first to break it, forcing a smile that did not match his eyes as he said, "Richard, I think there is some misunderstanding here. This is just a birthday dinner, nothing more." But my father did not look at him when he answered. He looked at the guests instead, and that alone made the air tighten even further. "Nothing here tonight is just anything," my father said calmly, and then he finally turned slightly toward Daniel, including the way certain narratives have been constructed about my daughter. I felt my name land differently in that moment, not as Emily the wife, not as Emily the guest, but as something that carried weight I had never been allowed to see before. Victoria shifted again in her seat, her composure thinning as she glanced toward Daniel, and I noticed for the first time that her hand was trembling slightly around her glass. Daniel let out a short laugh again, but it was sharper this time, more defensive. "Narratives? Emily is my wife. We are just having a conversation about seating arrangements," he said, and that was when my father nodded once, as if confirming something he had already expected. "Yes," he replied, and that is exactly where the problem begins. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room as people stopped pretending to eat or drink, and I felt my pulse slow in a way that was almost unnatural, like my body was trying to separate itself from what was happening. My father continued, "There was a formal advisory issued regarding tonight's arrangement. It included authority structure, guest designation, and financial control tied to this event." Daniel's expression changed immediately. I saw it before he even spoke, the small crack in confidence that appeared when words did not behave the way he expected them to. "That is not possible," he said quickly, turning slightly toward one of his associates seated nearby. "Who approved that?" No one answered him. That silence was louder than anything said so far. Victoria's smile finally disappeared completely. "Daniel," she said softly, leaning toward him. "What is he talking about?" But Daniel did not answer her either, because his attention had shifted back to my father, who was now placing a folder on the table in front of him with slow precision. "Emily Carter has been directly involved in the governance review of this event's hosting entity for the past several months," my father said, and I saw multiple heads turn toward me at once, as if I had suddenly become visible in a way that made no sense to them. Daniel shook his head slightly, his voice lowering. "No, that is not accurate. Emily does not work in anything like that. She is not involved in this level of structure." My father's expression did not change. "That is what she allowed you to believe," he said simply. The words hit differently than anything before them, because they did not accuse, they revealed. I felt my throat tighten as Daniel turned to me fully for the first time all evening, his face searching mine like I might correct what he was hearing. "Emily," he said more quietly now, "tell me what he is talking about." I did not answer immediately, because something in me was still catching up to the idea that there was something to answer. Victoria leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied me with a different kind of attention now, one that felt less confident and more uncertain. My father opened the folder on the table and slid a document forward. "The seating decision tonight was based on finalized advisory input tied to financial authority distribution," he said, "and Emily Carter's name appears on that authorization structure." Daniel stared at the paper without touching it. "That is not her signature," he said quickly, almost too quickly, as if speed could undo meaning. My father nodded slightly. "It is not something she ever needed to sign publicly," he replied, "because her role does not require visibility to function." I felt something inside me shift again, not emotionally, but cognitively, like pieces of information I had never been given were starting to align without my permission. Daniel stood up now, pushing his chair slightly back, his voice rising for the first time. "This is ridiculous. Emily, why would your father say this? Why would you let this happen?" And that was when Victoria spoke, her voice sharper now. "Daniel, you told me she was not involved in anything significant. You said she was just—" She stopped mid-sentence. Realizing too late what she was about to confirm, Daniel turned toward her instantly. "No, that is not what I said," he replied too fast again, but his denial did not land the way it used to. My father closed the folder slowly. "There has been a misunderstanding that benefited certain people in this room," he said, "and that misunderstanding ends tonight." I felt the room tilt slightly, not physically, but socially, like the structure people had been leaning on was suddenly unstable. One of Daniel's associates leaned in and whispered something urgently to him, and I saw Daniel's face change as he listened, the color draining from his expression in a way that made my stomach tighten. "That cannot be right," he said quietly, but his voice no longer carried certainty. Victoria looked between them both, her confidence fully gone now, replaced by something closer to disbelief. And then it happened. Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. Then again, each vibration louder than the last in the quiet room. He picked it up quickly, read the screen, and froze completely. I saw his hand stop moving. I saw his breath stop with it. And in that exact moment, whatever foundation he had been standing on in this room finally collapsed without sound, because the message he was reading was not just unexpected, it was impossible, according to everything he had believed until now. The moment Daniel Reed froze after reading his phone, the entire room seemed to hold its breath with him, and I watched his expression shift in real time, from confusion to disbelief to something far more unsettling, like the ground beneath him had quietly disappeared without warning. He whispered, almost inaudibly, "This is not possible," but his voice lacked conviction, and that absence of certainty traveled faster than any words he could say. Victoria Hale leaned closer, her voice sharp with urgency now. "Daniel, what is it? What does it say?" But he did not answer her, because he was already scrolling again, as if the first message had not been enough to break his understanding of the situation. My father stood still at the center of the room, not reacting, not explaining further, only watching as the consequences of something unseen began to surface in real time. I felt my phone vibrate again in my hand, and this time I looked down. Unknown number. One new email notification. Subject line, "Immediate compliance review confirmed." I did not open it yet, but something inside me tightened because I could feel that whatever Daniel was reading was connected to me in a way I still did not fully understand. Daniel suddenly looked up, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for an escape from information he could not unsee. "No," he said again, louder this time. "This must be a mistake. This is not real." His voice cracked slightly at the end, and that was when I realized this was no longer confidence being challenged. It was control slipping away. One of his associates stood up slightly, leaning over to look at his screen, then quickly sat back down without speaking. That small movement told me everything I needed to know. Something had already been verified by someone else in the room. Victoria's expression changed completely now, her earlier composure replaced with visible tension. "Daniel, you need to explain what is going on," she said, but her voice no longer carried authority, only uncertainty. Daniel finally turned toward her, his jaw tight. "I do not know," he said, but it sounded less like an answer and more like a defense collapsing under pressure. My father finally spoke again, calm and steady. "It appears the updated compliance directive has already been distributed to all authorized parties," he said, "which includes notification of Emily Carter's operational designation." The word designation hung in the air differently than anything else said tonight. It did not sound emotional, it sounded structural. Daniel's phone vibrated again, and this time he almost dropped it. He opened another message, and I saw his eyes move quickly across the screen, then stop completely. "This is from legal," he said slowly, as if reading it out loud would make it less real. "They are confirming a shift in oversight authority effective immediately." Victoria stood up slightly now, her chair scraping softly against the floor. "Shift in oversight authority of what exactly?" she asked, her voice breaking the controlled tone she had maintained all night. Daniel did not answer her immediately. Instead, he looked at me again, and this time there was something different in his expression. Not arrogance, not confusion, but something closer to realization that arrived too late to be useful. "Emily," he said quietly, almost carefully now, "what is this?" I did not answer right away, because I was still processing the fact that he was asking me that question at all, as if I had been outside of this conversation until now. My father stepped slightly closer to the table, placing both hands lightly on its edge. "It is the confirmation of authority structure that was outlined months ago," he said, "and which was acknowledged by every required party, except those who chose not to understand its implications." Daniel's breathing changed. I could see it in the way his shoulders lifted and dropped more quickly now, like each sentence was forcing him to adjust to a version of reality he had not prepared for. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, then finally said, "No one told me any of this." My father tilted his head slightly. "That is not accurate," he said calmly. "You were told. You simply chose to interpret it differently." The room had become almost completely silent now. Even the music in the background felt distant, irrelevant. Victoria looked between Daniel and me repeatedly, her confidence completely gone now, replaced with visible uncertainty. "This is not what you said would happen," she whispered toward Daniel, but he did not respond. Instead, he looked at his phone again, then at the table, then at me, as if trying to locate the point where everything had gone wrong. I felt something shift inside me again, not fear, not anger, but a growing sense of detachment, like I was watching a system reveal itself layer by layer. Daniel suddenly reached for another document on the table, pulling it closer, scanning it quickly. His hand paused halfway down the page. "This," he said quietly, "this includes Emily's name on governing authorization." His voice was no longer confident, it was searching. Victoria stepped back slightly, her hand going to the back of her chair as if she needed support. My mother finally spoke, her voice cautious. "Richard, what exactly does this mean for the dinner tonight?" My father did not look at her immediately. Instead, he looked at me. "It means," he said carefully, "that decisions made under incorrect assumptions about Emily Carter's role are now being formally reviewed in real time." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. "Reviewed by who?" he asked, but no one answered immediately, because the answer had already begun to form in the space between them all. My phone vibrated one more time. Another email, this one from Daniel. Subject line, "Emily, please respond." Body, "We need to talk now." I looked at it without replying, and for the first time since the night began, I felt something that was not confusion or shock, but distance. A separation between who I had been sitting here as and who they were suddenly trying to understand. And as Daniel stood there still holding his phone, waiting for an answer I did not yet feel ready to give, I realized something had already happened in this room, that no apology, no explanation, and no correction could undo. Daniel Reed stood frozen with his phone still in his hand, the screen glowing faintly as new notifications kept arriving, but none of them seemed capable of restoring the version of reality he had been standing on just minutes before. The room around us had shifted into something quieter, heavier, like every guest was now holding their breath without being told to. Victoria Hale was the first to sit back down, not gracefully this time, but slowly, as if her confidence had lost its structure. Daniel finally looked at me again, and his voice came out lower, less controlled. "Emily," he said, "just tell me what is happening, please." I did not answer immediately, because something inside me felt strangely distant, like I was listening to a conversation that had started without me years ago. My father remained standing at the center of the room, no longer speaking, simply observing the collapse of assumptions that had held this evening together. Daniel stepped slightly closer to me now, lowering his voice even further. "If this is about money, about influence, about anything that involves your father, I can fix it," he said quickly, as if fixing things was still an option that made sense. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "This is not something you fix," I said quietly, and my own voice surprised me with how calm it sounded. Victoria let out a small, uneven breath, then stood halfway before stopping, unsure whether she still belonged in the conversation at all. Daniel shook his head slightly, his expression tightening again. "Then what is it?" he asked, more desperate now than before. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated again, but this time I did not look at it immediately. I already knew the pattern of what was coming. My father finally spoke again, softer now, almost measured. "There is something else you should all understand before this continues," he said, and that sentence alone made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. Daniel turned toward him immediately. "Understand what?" My father paused briefly, then said, that Emily Carter has not been removed from anything tonight. She has simply been recognized. The word recognized felt strange in the air, like it did not belong in a conversation that had already been filled with misunderstanding. Daniel laughed once, but it was empty, unstable. Recognized for what? He asked, turning back to me again, his voice rising slightly. I could see something breaking in him now, not loudly, but in small, visible cracks, like exhaustion was catching up to denial. My mother finally spoke from her seat, her voice careful. "Richard, this is not appropriate for a celebration," she said, but even she sounded uncertain now, like she was no longer sure which version of the evening she was supposed to be protecting. My father did not look at her. Instead, he looked directly at Daniel. "What is not appropriate," he said calmly, "is continuing to operate under false assumptions when formal structure has already changed." Daniel took a step back, glancing around the room as if looking for someone to confirm that this was still just a misunderstanding. Victoria's voice came out quieter now. "Daniel, I think we should leave," she said, but even as she said it, she did not move. That hesitation said more than her words. My phone finally lit up again, and this time I looked. It was an email with multiple attachments. Legal confirmations, authorization summaries, names highlighted in lines I had never seen before. My own name appeared more than once, not as a guest, not as a participant, but as something far more formal than anything I had been prepared to emotionally process in a room like this. Daniel saw my expression change and immediately reached for my phone before stopping himself halfway. "What is it?" he asked again, but this time his voice was quieter, almost careful. I hesitated before answering, because the words felt too large for the space between us. "It is documentation," I said simply, "of what has already been decided." The room seemed to lean in slightly without anyone noticing they were doing it. Daniel stared at me, then at my father, then back at me again. "Decided by who?" he asked. My father answered instead. "By the board that has been reviewing structural oversight for months." Victoria finally sat fully down again, her shoulders lowering slightly as if her body had given up trying to maintain composure. Daniel shook his head again, slower now. "I was never informed of any board changes," he said, but his voice no longer carried certainty. My father nodded once. "You were informed," he said, "but not in the way you expected." That sentence landed differently than everything before it, because it suggested that the problem was not absence of information, but interpretation of it. Daniel looked at me again, and this time there was something almost fragile in his expression. "Emily," he said quietly, "why did you not tell me any of this?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering, and when I did, my voice was steady but distant. "Because you never asked the version of me that this concerned." The words did not come with anger, they came with clarity, and that clarity felt heavier than emotion. Victoria stood up again, more decisively this time. "I cannot stay here," she said, but even as she said it, she did not look at Daniel. She looked at the room, as if the room itself had changed ownership without warning. Daniel did not stop her. He did not move. He just stood there, staring at me as if waiting for the ground to return to how it used to feel. My father slowly stepped back from the table, his role in the room now complete, but the silence he left behind felt structured rather than empty. Daniel finally spoke again, but his voice was barely above a whisper. "So what happens now?" he asked. I looked at him, and for the first time that night, I realized I was no longer standing inside the moment that was breaking him. I was standing just outside of it. "Now," I said quietly, "you start realizing what you did not see." And as I said those words, I felt something inside me begin to shift, not toward chaos, but toward something unfamiliar, something that felt like the beginning of distance, and the first sign that whatever came next would no longer include the version of me that had been sitting quietly at this table. The room behind me felt distant now, like it belonged to a version of my life. I was no longer standing inside, and when I finally turned away from Daniel Reed, I did not look back even once, not because I was angry, but because something in me had quietly decided there was nothing left to wait for in that space. I walked out of the ballroom slowly, my heels touching the marble floor in steady rhythm, while conversations behind me faded into something unimportant, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than any words spoken that night. Outside the venue, the air was colder than I expected, and I stood there for a moment before opening my phone again, seeing messages still coming in, emails stacking one after another, all marked with the same structure, the same confirmation language that no longer felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I did not call anyone from the party, not Daniel, not my mother, not even my father, because for the first time I realized I was not waiting for permission to understand what was happening anymore. The next morning, I woke up in a hotel room I had booked without telling anyone, the city still quiet outside the window, and I sat there for several minutes just watching the light shift across the floor before I finally opened my laptop. There were no dramatic decisions, no emotional breakdowns, just a simple sequence of actions that started with reviewing documents that had been sent to me overnight, confirming roles, structures, and responsibilities. I had never fully seen laid out this clearly before. A message from a senior advisor appeared on my screen reading, "We are ready to proceed when you confirm your direction." I stared at it for a long moment before typing back, "Proceed with standard alignment protocols." It felt strange how simple it sounded, for something that had changed everything I thought my life was. Later that day, I met with someone I had never met in person before, a consultant named Andrew Keller, who looked at me without hesitation and said, "We expected you to step back after last night, but your position has already been registered as active." I asked him calmly, "What exactly does active mean in this context?" And he replied, "It means operational authority is now under your review for all pending decisions." There was no celebration in his voice, no excitement, just structure, like he was confirming weather conditions instead of something that affected lives. I remember sitting across from him in a quiet office downtown, listening as he explained processes, timelines, and oversight responsibilities in a way that made it clear nothing about this had been spontaneous. At one point, he slid a folder toward me and said, "You will need to begin reviewing legacy accounts immediately. Some of them are tied to long-standing personal networks." I opened the folder and saw names I recognized from the night before, including Daniel Reed's company structure, and I closed it again slowly without reacting. Andrew watched me carefully and said, "Most people in your position request support from family at this stage." I looked at him and answered simply, "I do not have that option." And it was true in a way I had never fully admitted before. Later that week, I received a call from my mother, Margaret Carter. Her voice was softer than usual. "Emily, people are asking questions," she said carefully. "About last night. About your father's statement." I stood in my apartment looking out at the city while I replied, "Then let them ask." There was a pause before she said, "You are not explaining anything to anyone?" And I answered, "There is nothing to explain yet." She did not respond for a moment, then said quietly, "Your father is not answering calls either." That sentence stayed with me longer than expected. When I spoke to Richard Carter 2 days later, his tone was different too, less directive, more observational. "You are moving faster than expected," he said. I asked him, "Is that a problem?" And he replied, "No, it means you are no longer reacting." I did not fully understand what he meant at the time, but I understood what was happening around me. Meetings replaced silence. Documents replaced assumptions, and my name began appearing in conversations where it had never been acknowledged before. Daniel did not contact me directly, but I saw references to him through intermediary updates, reports marked with changes in decision flow, adjustments in authority acknowledgement, and each one felt like a layer being stripped away from a version of life I had once thought was permanent. One evening, I received a short message from Victoria Hale. It simply said, "I did not understand what I was walking into." I did not reply. Instead, I continued working through the files in front of me, noticing how everything I touched seemed to connect back into systems I had been unaware of but had always been part of. There was no sudden transformation, no dramatic victory, only a slow realization that my life had been operating on a level I had never been invited to see clearly until now. And as I closed my laptop that night, I realized something quietly unsettling but strangely grounding. I was no longer being introduced into a new world. I was beginning to recognize one I had already been inside without knowing it, and somewhere in that realization, the first clear path toward what came next had already started forming. The days after that quiet shift in my life began to take shape in a way I could not have predicted, not through chaos or sudden revelation, but through structure, schedules, and responsibilities that slowly replaced the uncertainty I had been living in for years. I found myself in offices I had never entered before, sitting across from people who spoke to me with a level of formality that felt unfamiliar at first, as if they were still adjusting to a version of me they had not fully met yet. On the third morning, I was handed a security badge with my name printed clearly on it. Emily Carter, Advisory Operations Director. I stood there for a moment just looking at it, feeling the weight of something simple, becoming unexpectedly significant, like a label that had finally caught up to a life that had been moving ahead without explanation. The man issuing it, a senior coordinator named Marcus Hill, adjusted his glasses and said, "You will need to wear this at all times inside the main facility." I nodded and clipped it onto my blazer without responding, feeling the small plastic card rest against fabric like a quiet confirmation of something irreversible. When I walked into the main operations floor later that morning, the room shifted slightly, not in sound, but in attention. Conversations did not stop, but they slowed, like people were recalculating how to interact with me. One of the analysts looked up and said, "Good morning, Director Carter." And I remember how strange it felt to hear my last name attached to something that carried authority instead of just identity. I responded simply, "Good morning," and continued walking, because I was still learning how to exist in this version of myself without hesitation. During a briefing later that day, I was presented with a portfolio overview that included regional accounts, structural oversight documentation, and long-term advisory projections. A woman across the table named Hannah Reeves slid a tablet toward me and said, "These are the current active assignments under your review scope." I looked at the screen, scanning through names, figures, and operational notes that felt like they belonged to a world I had only recently been allowed to see clearly. Hannah paused for a moment before adding, "Most people in your position request a transition period, but your approval cycle was accelerated." I asked her calmly, "By whom?" And she replied, "By the board directive issued prior to last quarter's restructuring." There was no emotion in her explanation, just fact. Later, as I walked through the hallway, I noticed my reflection in the glass panels lining the corridor, and for the first time I saw myself not as someone entering a role, but as someone already standing inside it. My clothing had changed slightly too, not dramatically, but intentionally. A tailored black blazer, minimal design, and the same name badge that now felt less like identification and more like recognition. In one of the conference rooms, I overheard two executives speaking quietly as I passed. One of them said, "She is handling the Reed account directly now," and the other replied, "That explains the overnight structural shift." I did not stop walking, but I felt the weight of those words settle differently inside me, because I knew exactly who they were referring to. Daniel Reed had not contacted me since that night, but his presence still existed in the reports I reviewed, updates marked in procedural language that replaced personal memory with operational consequence. At one point, Andrew Keller, the consultant I had met earlier, entered the room and placed a document in front of me. "This confirms your escalation authority," he said. I looked at him and asked, "Escalation to what level?" He answered without hesitation, "Final review tier for pending advisory decisions across multiple divisions." I sat back slightly, absorbing the clarity of what he was saying, realizing that nothing about this position was symbolic anymore. It was functional, measurable, and already active whether I fully felt ready for it or not. That evening, I stood alone in the office overlooking the city, holding the same badge in my hand for a moment before clipping it back onto my jacket. My phone lit up with a message from an unknown internal contact that read, "Board confirmation phase 2 scheduled for tomorrow morning." I read it twice, then placed the phone back down on the table. The reflection in the glass showed someone I was still becoming, not fully defined yet, but no longer uncertain. And as I looked out over the city lights, I understood that this was not the end of anything that had started at that party. It was simply the point where the present finally caught up to everything I had already begun to become, and tomorrow would continue shaping that reality, whether I was ready or not. The morning after the notification about the board confirmation phase 2, I arrived at the headquarters earlier than usual, the city still half asleep behind the glass walls of the building, and for the first time I noticed how different silence feels when it is no longer filled with uncertainty, but with expectation. My security badge tapped softly against my blazer as I stepped into the elevator, and the digital panel reflected my name again. Emily Carter, Advisory Operations Director, a label that no longer felt unfamiliar but still did not fully feel like something I had grown into completely. When the doors opened on the executive floor, there was a subtle shift in energy. People were already moving with quiet urgency, papers in hand, phones pressed close to ears, and conversations that stopped briefly when I passed. "Good morning, Director Carter," one of the assistants said again, her voice more confident than the first time I heard it, and I simply nodded as I walked toward the main conference room where I had been scheduled for a pre-review briefing. Inside the room, the lights were slightly dimmed, and the long table was already filled with documents arranged with precise alignment, each folder labeled with regions, divisions, and names that I was still learning to fully connect. Andrew Keller was already there, standing near the far end of the table, reviewing something on his tablet. He looked up as I entered and said, "You are early," I replied. "I did not sleep much." He nodded once as if that was expected. "That is normal before your first full board alignment review," he said calmly. I sat down at the table, placing my phone beside the documents, and noticed a new folder at my seat, labeled Restricted Briefing. I did not open it immediately. Instead, I looked at Andrew and asked, "What exactly will be reviewed today?" He hesitated for only a second before answering, "Final confirmation of authority distribution across active advisory structures, including legacy personal associations." The phrase legacy personal associations made something tighten inside me, but I kept my expression steady. "That includes all external relations?" I asked. He nodded. "Yes, including family-linked entities." For a moment, the room felt smaller, like the walls had moved closer without anyone touching them. My phone vibrated on the table, and when I looked at it, there was a message from my mother, Margaret Carter. "We need to talk before today escalates further." I did not respond. A few minutes later, another message appeared, this time from an unknown number, but I recognized the pattern immediately from previous days. It simply said, "Do not proceed without clarification from Daniel Reed." I stared at it longer than I intended, feeling something shift in my chest that was not fear but anticipation mixed with uncertainty. Andrew noticed my silence and said, "If there is any personal conflict affecting your review capacity, now is the time to declare it." I looked up at him and replied quietly, "There is no conflict affecting my capacity." He accepted that without further question. The room began filling gradually after that, senior board representatives entering one by one, each of them acknowledging me with measured formality that still felt slightly unreal. One of them, a man named Harold Finch, took his seat across from me and said, "We did not expect your direct presence in this phase." I responded, "I was assigned accordingly." He nodded slowly, studying me for a moment longer than necessary before looking down at his documents. The atmosphere in the room tightened as more participants arrived, and I noticed that no one mentioned Daniel Reed directly, but his name existed in the silence between references, like something everyone was avoiding saying out loud. Andrew finally placed the main briefing file in front of me and said, "Once this begins, all associated declarations will be verified in real time." I opened the folder slowly for the first time, scanning through structured pages of confirmations, timelines, and decision logs that included multiple layers of approval history. As I read, I became aware that every document was pointing toward a single convergence point scheduled for today's session. My phone vibrated again, and this time I almost answered without thinking, but stopped myself at the last second. Instead, I looked at the screen. It was Daniel Reed. "We are at the headquarters. They told me you are inside the review room. Please, just tell me what is going on before this goes any further." I did not reply. I placed the phone face down on the table. Andrew leaned slightly closer and said, "They will be entering shortly." I asked, "Who is they?" He answered, "The final confirmation parties for legacy authorization alignment." And at that exact moment, I heard the sound of the conference room doors opening behind me, slow and deliberate, followed by footsteps entering the space, and I did not turn around immediately because something in me already understood that whatever I was about to hear next was no longer something I could avoid, and the truth that had been circling around me since that night at the party was finally about to be spoken out loud in front of everyone. The sound of footsteps entering the conference room behind me was slow and deliberate, not rushed, not uncertain, but controlled in a way that immediately changed the atmosphere before I even turned around. I already knew who it was before I saw them, because the room itself reacted first, shifting into a silence that felt intentional rather than accidental. Andrew Keller did not move, but his eyes followed the entrance carefully, and the board members around the table straightened slightly in their seats as if acknowledging a presence that carried weight beyond explanation. I turned my head slowly and saw Daniel Reed standing at the doorway, not alone, but accompanied by 2 senior legal representatives and 1 administrative liaison I recognized from previous briefings. Victoria Hale was not with him, and that absence alone felt significant. Daniel's eyes immediately found mine, and for the first time since that night at the party, there was no confidence in his expression, only controlled uncertainty. He stepped forward slightly, stopping just inside the room, and said carefully, "We were told this meeting would clarify the situation." His voice was calm, but it did not carry authority anymore. My father, Richard Carter, seated near the far side of the table, did not speak immediately. Instead, he placed his hands together and looked across the room as if confirming that all required parties were now present. Then he said quietly, "It will." The word landed heavily because it did not promise comfort, it promised conclusion. Daniel looked toward me again, this time longer, searching for something familiar, something stable. "Emily," he said, softer now, "can you please tell me what this is? Because everything I have received in the last 24 hours contradicts everything I was previously told." I did not respond immediately. Instead, I opened the folder in front of me fully for the first time, letting the document settle into view. The room remained silent as I scanned the top page, then I looked up and spoke calmly. "What you were told was incomplete," I said. Daniel took a step forward. "Incomplete how?" he asked. Andrew interjected before I could respond, his voice precise. "Operational authority was reassigned under board directive 6 months ago. All affected parties were notified through formal advisory channels." Daniel shook his head slightly. "I never received anything that indicated this level of change," he said, turning briefly toward one of the legal representatives beside him. The representative nodded once and said, "Notification was delivered to your corporate legal inbox with acknowledgement protocol active." Daniel's expression changed subtly at that, because that meant it had been received even if it had not been processed. He looked back at me again, and his voice lowered. "So what exactly does this mean for us?" he asked. The word "us" lingered in the air longer than expected, because no one responded to it immediately. My father finally spoke again, measured and direct. "It means the assumptions governing personal and professional overlap have been formally reviewed and restructured," he said. Daniel let out a short breath, then said, "That does not answer anything." I closed the folder gently and looked at him directly. "It answers everything you needed to understand before tonight," I said. The room felt tighter after that sentence, like the space between people had been reduced by something invisible. Daniel's voice softened again, but now it carried something closer to disbelief. "You have been involved in this," he said, "all of this time, and you never said anything." I nodded slightly, because there was nothing to say until it became relevant. Victoria's absence suddenly felt louder than her presence ever had, because her influence was no longer in the room to balance Daniel's assumptions. He looked around again, this time slower, as if trying to reconstruct a version of events that still made sense. "So the seating, the documents, the messages, all of it was structured?" he asked. Andrew replied. "It was procedural." Daniel turned back toward me again, and his expression finally shifted into something quieter, more unstable. "Then what am I supposed to be now?" he asked. There was no arrogance left in his tone, only confusion. I paused before answering, because this was the first moment where the conversation was no longer about systems or documents, but about identity collapsing in real time. "You are still yourself," I said quietly. "You are just no longer operating under the assumptions you were relying on." That answer did not comfort him. It did not anger him either. It simply removed the illusion of control he had been holding on to. One of the legal representatives placed a final document on the table and said, "This confirms final alignment status for all associated entities." Daniel reached for it slowly, scanning the page, and I saw his hand tighten slightly as he read further down. He stopped at a section that clearly referenced my name again, and this time his voice did not rise. It dropped. "This cannot be correct," he said quietly. My father answered immediately, "It is verified." Daniel looked up at me again, and for the first time his voice was no longer trying to challenge what he was hearing, only trying to understand it. "Emily, did you know this was going to happen that night at the party?" he asked. I held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "No," I said honestly. I did not understand it fully until afterward. That was the first time I saw something like regret surface in his expression, but it was not dramatic. It was quiet, internal, almost unspoken. The room remained still, every person present aware that something irreversible had already taken place, even if it had not been fully named yet. Andrew finally closed his tablet and said, "This concludes confirmation phase 2. No one moved immediately. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, then slowly lowered the document back onto the table, as if the weight of it had become too difficult to hold. He looked at me one final time, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Then what happens next?" he asked. And in that moment, before anyone answered him, I realized that the part of the story where everything was hidden had officially ended, and whatever came after this would no longer be about explanation, but about consequence. The room remained still long after Daniel Reed asked what happens next, and no one immediately answered him, because the truth that had been placed on the table was no longer just information, it had become structure, and structure does not speak twice for those who refuse to hear it the first time. My father, Richard Carter, slowly gathered the documents in front of him, not with urgency, but with finality, as if the discussion had already crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. Daniel stood where he was, still holding onto the edge of the table slightly, his posture no longer defensive, but unstable in a way that was beginning to show in small, visible shifts. Victoria Hale had already been escorted out of the room earlier without ceremony, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than her presence ever did, and now only the remaining core of people stayed, as if waiting for something to either collapse or stabilize. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice lower now. "So what does this mean for us outside of this room?" he asked, and for the first time there was no attempt to control the tone of his question. I looked at him for a moment before answering, because the answer no longer belonged to emotion, it belonged to consequence. "It means boundaries are now defined where they were previously assumed," I said calmly. My mother, Margaret Carter, shifted slightly in her seat, her hands clasped tightly together. "Emily," she said carefully, "is this really necessary now? After everything that has already happened?" I turned toward her slowly. "It was always necessary," I replied, not sharply, but firmly enough that it ended the possibility of soft interpretation. Daniel exhaled slowly, looking down at the table as if trying to find the version of reality he had been operating under only days ago. "I did not recognize any of this," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. My father finally spoke again, his tone measured but final. "Recognition is not the same as acknowledgement," he said, "and acknowledgement is not optional at this stage." That sentence changed the atmosphere again, not loudly, but completely. Daniel looked up at me, and this time his expression carried something closer to exhaustion than disbelief. "What do you want from me now?" he asked. The question was simple, but it did not feel simple in the room. I took a moment before answering, because for the first time I realized the question itself was no longer relevant in the way it used to be. "I do not want anything," I said quietly. "This is not about want anymore." My words made him pause. He stepped back slightly from the table, as if the space between us had become redefined without physical movement. My father placed the final document back into the folder and closed it. "Effective immediately," he said, "all advisory interactions will follow structured separation protocol." Daniel nodded slowly, but I could see he was still processing what that meant in practice. "So that is it," he said quietly. "Everything just stops here." I shook my head slightly. "Nothing stops," I replied. "It just continues differently." That answer seemed to land heavier than anything before it, because it removed the illusion of finality and replaced it with continuation. Daniel ran one hand through his hair, looking down at the table again, then back up at me. "You never gave any indication that this was your position in all of this," he said. I met his eyes steadily. "Because it was never part of what you chose to see," I answered. My mother finally stood up slowly, adjusting her coat as if trying to regain composure through routine movement. "Emily," she said softly, "what happens to the family relationship now?" The question hung in the air longer than expected, because it was not about structure or authority. It was about identity after structure had changed. I looked at her for a long moment before responding. "The relationship remains," I said, "but it no longer defines access to decisions." That sentence made her pause. Daniel looked between us, then back at me. "So where do I stand in all of this now?" he asked again, quieter this time, almost careful. I hesitated for the first time, not because I did not know the answer, but because the answer was no longer personal in the way it used to be. "You stand where you are," I said finally. with awareness of what has changed. That was the first time he did not immediately respond. Instead, he simply nodded once, slowly, as if accepting that resistance was no longer the correct response. Andrew Keller stepped forward slightly, breaking the silence. "There will be follow-up documentation sent to all parties within 24 hours, he said. "No immediate action is required beyond acknowledgement." Daniel looked at him briefly, then back at me. "Acknowledgement of what exactly?" he asked. Andrew replied without hesitation. "Of current structure." The phrase felt final in a way that removed ambiguity. Daniel slowly stepped away from the table now, no longer engaging, just absorbing. I could see the shift in him was not dramatic, but internal, like something had settled that could not be undone. My father gathered the remaining materials and looked at me one last time. "You have clarity now," he said quietly. I nodded. "Yes," I replied. After that, he turned and left the room without further comment. One by one, others followed, leaving only silence and the faint echo of what had just been confirmed. Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, then finally looked at me again. There was no anger in his expression now, only something unresolved. "I do not know how to adjust to this version of reality," he said quietly. I answered honestly. "You do not need to adjust immediately," I said. "You only need to understand it exists." He nodded slightly again, then turned and walked toward the exit, slower than before, as if each step required reconsideration. I stayed where I was, alone in the conference room now, looking at the empty seats, the closed folders, and the stillness that followed structured decisions. Nothing was resolved in the emotional sense, but something had clearly shifted beyond reversal. And as I stood there, I understood that the next phase would no longer be about revelation or confrontation, but about living inside the consequences of everything that had already been decided, even if not everyone was ready to accept it yet. In the days after everything settled, the world did not suddenly become perfect, but it became clearer, quieter in a way that allowed me to finally hear my own thoughts without them being shaped by someone else's expectations. The conference room where everything had shifted that day no longer felt like the center of my life, yet its impact stayed with me in small, steady ways, like a permanent adjustment to how I understood silence, authority, and truth. I returned to my work, not as someone trying to prove a point anymore, but as someone who understood the responsibility that comes with being placed in a position where decisions affect more than just personal emotion. The badge I once looked at with hesitation now felt ordinary on my blazer, and yet every time I clipped it on in the morning, I was reminded that identity is not always something you are given at the beginning of your story. Sometimes it is something you grow into after everything you thought was stable has already changed. Daniel Reed did not disappear from the narrative of my life overnight, but his presence transformed into something distant, no longer shaping my daily choices or defining my sense of worth. There were no dramatic confrontations after that final meeting, no loud apologies or emotional resolutions, only structured distance and quiet acknowledgement that what once was could no longer function in the same way. My mother, Margaret Carter, called once, her voice careful, asking how I was adjusting to everything, and I told her I was learning to separate expectation from reality. My father, Richard Carter, and I spoke less about outcomes and more about process, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was being seen not as a reflection of someone else's decisions, but as an individual navigating my own. I often thought back to the night at the birthday party, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of detached understanding of how easily perception can shape entire relationships until truth interrupts it. What I learned most from everything that unfolded was not about power or authority, but about clarity, the kind that arrives slowly and often only after discomfort forces it into existence. I learned that silence does not always mean acceptance, and that being overlooked does not define your value unless you allow it to remain unchallenged inside your own understanding of self. There were days when I still felt the echo of that moment when I was asked to sit away from the table, but now it felt less like a wound and more like a reference point, something that showed me exactly where I had chosen to stop shrinking. One afternoon, I stood alone in my apartment looking out at the city, holding my security badge between my fingers, turning it slowly as the light reflected off its surface. And I realized how strange it was that something so small could represent such a significant shift in how I existed in the world. It was not the badge itself that mattered, but what it represented. the recognition that my voice had weight even when I was not the loudest person in the room. I began to understand that strength is not always about confrontation. Sometimes it is about continuity, about continuing forward without needing permission from the people who once defined your limits. If there is one thing I would say to anyone listening who feels unseen or underestimated, it is this: your value is not determined by where others choose to place you, but by how you choose to stand when you realize you were never meant to remain small. There is a quiet kind of healing that comes when you stop asking for validation from places that were never designed to give it freely, and instead begin to trust the part of yourself that has been steady even when everything around you was uncertain. I am Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and the most important lesson I carry from everything that happened is this: you do not lose yourself when others fail to see you. You lose yourself only when you stop seeing your own worth. And if this story reached you in a moment where you needed it most, take a breath and remember that you are not behind, you are not invisible, and you are not defined by the space others tried to assign you. Sometimes life removes you from a table not to punish you, but to show you that you were meant to build a stronger one of your own. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for allowing this story to exist alongside your own for a little while. If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments, and consider subscribing if you want to hear more stories like this. Stories about truth, growth, and the quiet strength it takes to rebuild yourself from moments that once felt like endings. And as you go on with your day, carry this gently with you. Even when everything feels uncertain, there is still a part of you that is already moving towards something better than what you left behind. Not every ending is loud. Some endings are simply the beginning of finally understanding who you were all along. And if you would like to continue this journey, there are more stories waiting for you in the playlist, each one carrying its own version of truth, its own quiet turning point, and its own reminder that what feels like loss at first is sometimes only the first step towards something you were always meant to find, and the next story may be closer to your own than you expect.